Did you know that there are a record number of Canadians experiencing randomized attacks? And also, did you know that there's a record number of Canadians dying of drug overdoses? The question is Canada dying? And that's what we're going to talk about with my next guest, Aaron Gunn.
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense, and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
The downtown east side Vancouver is third world.
We live in an open prison yard.
Why should my kids have to live in that risk and that danger?
Other citizens have rights as well. You have a right not to inhale secondhand crystal meth smoke.
It's really a case of the inmates running the asylum.
What is happening to Canada, a country once considered immune from the most appalling displays of homelessness and chaos, has become an epicenter for shocking, violent, and at times random attacks as drug use has burst into the open and a devastating battle with addiction has literally left tens of thousands of Canadians dead. But what is the solution? Do we simply need a so-called safe supply of toxic drugs? Should more provinces follow the lead of BC and decriminalize fentanyl, meth, and cocaine? Or is it time to put victims first, crack down on crime, and get addicts the help and treatment they so desperately need?
I hate the word safe supply because you would probably think it was safe to take. And that's the problem, is that it's not safe.
Most people who are using this have never tried drugs before this. It's definitely creating a lot more addicts than there was before.
What we're doing now is almost capital punishment in our streets by neglect.
This is like the industrialization of addiction. It's as scary as it gets.
Aaron Gunn, the producer of that hard-hitting documentary, Is Canada Dying? Welcome to our program today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here to chat about these issues.
Well, Aaron, speaking of these issues, you're taking on two big issues in our country today. One is about the whole policy about drugs, specifically the whole idea of safe drug supply. And secondly, you're talking about the issue of criminal changes to how we treat offenders in the law. So why did you decide to take on those two big topics, those two big policy areas that are impacting Canadians?
Well, I think growing up in coastal British Columbia, you've seen these issues getting worse and worse. You've seen these random violent attacks, which you mentioned. You've seen the homelessness issue get worse and worse, just this general kind of chaos and disorder in our streets. And obviously the overdose deaths, over 2,000 in British Columbia alone last year, dead from drug overdoses. And I really want to know, because I had a feeling that these might all be connected. And the other reason I really set out to make this documentary, as you obviously know here in BC, it's been almost impossible to challenge the orthodoxy on these issues, this harm reduction or so-called harm reduction orthodoxy that has been in place for pretty much the whole time I've been politically active or aware, certainly over the past 20, 25 years. And as somebody who lives here and walks down these streets, to me, it's kind of like, if this is success, what does failure look like? And yet all we hear is a doubling down on the exact same policies or arguments from certain individuals that we haven't gone far enough. And from my perspective, I thought it was time to have an actual debate or discussion about these issues. And maybe there's another side to the story and maybe we should explore it.
Exactly. Now, Aaron, you use the word orthodoxy. What do you mean by orthodoxy?
Well, I guess so, as it pertains to the harm reduction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's an ideology, really. I think it's this ideology of probably stems from an ideology of a group of people in our society that don't believe in individual agency or individual responsibility, or the if something happens to an individual, it's always society's fault at large, and thus society should pay the consequences for that, as opposed to the individual absorbing them. So I think there is a real ideology or orthodoxy around these kinds of issues. Again, to me, though, I think most Canadians, most British Columbians aren't ideological. They just want policies that work, and they're busy raising their families and going to work and living their lives. And to me, it's just so obvious that over the past 20 years, what we've been doing hasn't been working, and violent crimes have been getting out of control. I chatted with only one made it into the video, but a handful of mothers whose sons were murdered by repeat violent offenders who should have never been out on our streets in the first place. You see everyday businesses having to deal with the consequences of prolific offenders that just, it's in the jail one day, out that afternoon and committing the exact same crimes, whether it's shoplifting or vandalism, and the businesses that are having to deal with this. And then talking just to the everyday residents who no longer feel safe, whether it's riding the transit systems in Calgary or Toronto, or whether it's walking in parts of downtown Vancouver, or smaller cities like Victoria and London and Kelowna. So I think it's a combination of these issues where this isn't right. Clearly, the interests of criminals and certain advocacy groups are being placed ahead of those of everyday tax-paying citizens, and I think there's a general degree of people being fed up. And I don't think it's ideal. I don't think it's left or right. The people that are, I think it's just normal people that are saying this is out of control. So those are the issues that I wanted to focus on. And then, of course, with regard to safe supply, the really kind of disturbing fact set that our government is now fueling the next wave of this crisis.
So well summarized, Aaron. So I did want to walk through a bit more systematically the points that you make in the documentary, because it is really well done. I do recommend it to people. In fact, it's amazing. As of this date, you've already surpassed 1 million views. Are you surprised by that?
Well, I had another documentary before this called Vancouver is Dying, which was
Mhm.
definitely the biggest documentary that I had done. And the question really was, after I did Vancouver is Dying, is people reached out to me from across the country and said, you have to come to my city, like insert Canadian city here. The same thing is happening. And maybe it's not as bad as Vancouver. Vancouver is still kind of the epicenter of this.
Mhm.
But, the same criminal justice policies of the federal government, the same um, easy access to opioids and drug policies being pushed by the federal government are in play in most of the country as well.
Mhm.
And when you copy and paste the same policies, you get similar results. So that being said, you never know when you put out a video how it's going to do. And this was a lot longer than anything I'd done before. The average I used to mainly do 3-4 minute videos, and then the average documentary maybe 25 minutes, and this is 80 minutes long.
Mhm.
And we might normally interview 8 or 9 people. We interviewed 49 for this project. So it was much different in scale and scope. So I wasn't sure how it's going to do, but it's nice to see the response from Canadians. I mean, it's unfortunate in some degree as well,
Mhm.
because it shows that these problems are very real and impacting people's lives, and they're
Mhm.
looking for
Mhm.
alternatives.
Well, what I really appreciated about the documentary and the approach you took was it was very insightful in terms of both information and statistics, but it was also very thoughtful about your talk with real victims of these policies and leaders across the country about why this is going on. So, on that note, I did want to talk a little bit about the whole phenomenon of random assaults in our country, and you had mentioned that as of March 23rd, in Canada, I believe that was the statistic. They're up by some 32%. It's really quite disturbing. And so my question is this: what are random assaults, and why did you begin the documentary talking about that particular issue?
Well, I think random assaults or random murders are well, to differentiate them are basically are assaults or murders that are random, that aren't targeted. Obviously, there's another issue of kind of gang violence and things like that that happen. That's targeted. That is obviously concerning for its own reasons, but it has less of an impact, I think, to people's personal safety or the average citizen's personal safety. Contrast that with random attacks, and these are people that are just going about their daily lives downtown, and then who are just violently assaulted.
Innocent
So
Canadians.
innocent Canadians, yes, and the well, why we chose to start the documentary with that is simply, I think, because it's been in the news a lot, and because the thesis, I think, running throughout this whole documentary is that the addictions crisis that is in part currently being fueled by government policies is leading to a lot of these other externalities. So the random violence, a lot of that is being driven by drug-induced psychosis or mental illnesses that have been set off by addiction and drug issues, and you can't separate the two. They're connected. And I talked to police officers. Obviously, there's always been crime and violent crime, but these random assaults, these people that never used to happen in the to the way they're happening now. Every week there's something. There was a 16-year-old boy waiting to catch the subway in Toronto who's just stabbed to death randomly. It's not like he's getting mugged. He just randomly.
And this was the story, Aaron, of Gabrielle Magalise, as I recall.
Yeah, yeah. So that's one of the ones we started with. There's the young father outside of Starbucks downtown Vancouver on Granville Street that got a lot of attention. There's other people stabbed to death on the SkyTrain in Vancouver, buses in Toronto, and elsewhere as well. So it's in Edmonton. There was a very prominent attack of a mother and her young son that got randomly attacked and murdered for no reason in broad daylight. And again, this isn't like your traditional
Yeah.
warped serial killer. These are happening in broad daylight by people.
But to be clear, in this case, you have an attack on an innocent Canadian for no rational reason, and these people have been, brutally killed in front of their family or others. It's truly shocking. I don't think, in my memory, I can recall the number of these instances ever happening before in our country. Can you?
No, I can't. And specifically as it pertains to the randomness. Like I said, there's always been kind of gang violence and things like that. And that's a separate issue.
Yeah.
The randomness of people just walking, and sometimes these are nice neighborhoods, upper class neighborhoods. And in Toronto, people are afraid of taking the metro anymore.
It's
People are afraid
crazy.
of the subway.
So, Aaron, in this case, the perpetrators, the people who've brutally undertaken these crimes, do they have something in common? Is it really pretty straight up what they have in common?
Well, one thing that they almost all have in common, without exception, is the fact that they've had multiple and escalating interactions with Canada's justice system. So the odds of someone having no criminal record and committing one of these random violent assaults or murders is quite low. It still happens, I think, with some of the drug issues and stuff that's going on. But there's a whole bunch of cases that we covered where you had individuals with over 50 prior criminal convictions, violent criminal convictions,
50
over
prior convictions.
50 prior convictions, charged more than 100 times, violent attacks, either being released by the criminal justice system and parole boards with the note that this person is likely to violently reoffend again, and yet we release them back into our streets. And it's interesting because there's been this obsession with rehabilitation in Canada's justice system, and a real downplaying of the concept of justice at all, that a victim or their family deserves some kind of justice or some kind of restitution, is almost in this country seems like an antiquated notion. What's really new is this kind of deference to the criminal, or the person who's been criminally charged and convicted of crimes, is now outweighing public safety. The fact that this person's going to go out again and is very likely to commit another violent assault or murder. It's really shocking, and it's sad, and it's disturbing. And it just shows, I think, how broken our justice system
I,
is.
I think Canadians would be just shocked to hear that someone can undertake offense after offense and still be out on the loose and recommitting those offenses again and again. It's truly is shocking. So I was intrigued, Aaron, that you were talking with a lot of people, including leaders within the justice system, some of whom are police chiefs. I know that you spoke with, if memory serves me correctly, former police chief Mark Saunders with the Toronto Police, and he said something very interesting. He said, "Whatever we do as a society, we can't normalize this type of crime." What did you think he meant by that?
I think in the same way that you talked about these random attacks, especially in the frequency that they're happening, was not something that we're used to, that didn't wasn't happening 15, 20 years ago. We shouldn't become used to it. We shouldn't
Mhm.
get to a point where people are just have come to expect and live with the fact that if you go downtown, you might be randomly assaulted or attacked, and it's basically did not go downtown anymore, and that's just the world that we're living in. That is the danger if you normalize this kind of behavior. So I think that's what the former police chief, who's now running for mayor, by the way, in Toronto,
Oh, yes.
was
Okay.
speaking to. And that's what we heard from a lot of people is you don't want to normalize this. It also goes with some of the homelessness in the tent cities. This was not something that I ever remember growing up. And then in the
Mhm.
past 5, 7 years, they're in BC. They're cropping up all over the place. They're obviously also organized by activists. And you see what happens in the downtown east side. It's almost like the downtown east side, where it once was an exception, it's now become almost a model that is being attempted to be
Mhm.
replicated in other cities across BC and across the country.
So that's something I did want to pick up. It's just fascinating that you mentioned that, is that you have this happening right across the country, and I've certainly seen it. But also you have something that a lot of Canadians may not be aware of, but you have different organized groups, some of which are actually funded by different governments that are in some ways trying to normalize it. Is that a fair comment or observation?
Well, they're certainly trying to normalize drug use, hard drug use. There's
Mhm.
many of those groups available, and they're certainly attempting to. They're organizing a lot of these homeless camps,
Mhm.
and they are. I mean, the homeless people are not organizing themselves into these camps, which shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody.
Mhm.
And they're organized into these camps for political reasons. It gets a little bit more. I mean, usually they're trying to almost, in a sense, blackmail the government or blackmail the population into giving them free stuff, giving them more money to house these individuals in perpetuity for free
Mhm.
with free drugs and all sorts of other benefits.
Mhm.
And so that's all kind of wrapped up together. And that's obviously problematic for a lot of reasons. But there's a lot of, I call it the poverty industrial complex in a
Mm.
lot of ways. There's a lot of people making a lot of money. There's I feel like we're well tuned as a society to uh, to have a degree of hesitancy or well placed skepticism in large corporations, billion-dollar corporations. But there's almost, I think, that degree of healthy skepticism and awareness isn't there necessarily for some of these smaller operations, these so-called nonprofits, who are actually getting millions of dollars and supporting themselves and paying themselves quite handsomely, who combined kind of make up this network in the downtown east side, for
Mhm.
example, that's
Mhm.
extracting tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars
Yeah.
from the government, from taxpayers, that we're all paying for,
But
with no results to show for it, by the way.
yeah, but I think that's a very insightful point, is that it's not for lack of money necessarily. It's how it's being used and frankly, the approach that's being taken. And that gets back to your comment about orthodoxy, the kind of assumed approach that things like this, these issues need to be looked at, and how that's not, you can't question that or evaluate it. Maybe we could talk a little bit about significant criminal legislation, bills. We have Bill C-5 about minimum sentencing, and of course Bill C-75, where kind of the first opening for any judge is to put an offender on release, on bail. So I think you do a really good job in the documentary pointing out the significance of that legislation. How much of a difference did they make in terms of this mess that we find ourselves in?
I think quite a bit. I mean, C-75 especially. That's the bail reform legislation that was passed in 2019. So C-5, first of all, it's kind of a combination of so that legislation removed a bunch of mandatory minimums that ensured that people that were found guilty of crimes like armed robbery spent a minimum amount of time in jail. Serious crimes, I think it's 14 different offenses.
Wow.
The
Like
uh,
including armed robbery, Aaron.
including armed robbery, including kidnapping. There's a series of different various firearm offenses. The so the other part of that we didn't get into in the documentary was some of these mandatory minimums were also struck down by the Supreme Court, which is another piece of this wheel that's the problem. But
The Supreme Court.
yeah, so this the Supreme Court, and I will say just to emphasize to people, the reason why there's all this stuff seems to be moving in a certain direction that's making this problem worse and worse, almost in unison, is because it is about a culture. It's a culture of, the individual is not responsible for their actions. There's some kind of collective guilt that society needs to bear the burden of
Mhm.
in rehabilitating this person and releasing them as quickly as possible. And that's embodied most almost in perfect form in Bill C-75, where
Mhm.
there's explicit legislation that basically said outside of exceptional circumstances, individuals charged with crimes, including violent crimes, should be released onto bail. And the consequences of that have been shocking. There's obviously been very high profile murders like the OPP officer. There's also been just random, not increases in these random attacks. So Windsor, for example, there has been, since this bill has passed, a 400% increase in violent attacks uh, committed by people out on bail since the passage of Bill
Wow.
C-75.
400% in Windsor, Ontario.
Windsor, Ontario alone. In Edmonton, in the 3 years since the passage of Bill C-75, there's been over 24 homicides committed in which one of the suspects was an individual who was currently out on bail for something else.
Wow.
There was 2,100 violent assaults committed in 3 years by people who were out on bail. In British Columbia, the judges granted bail 75% of the time to individuals accused of a violent attack, of a violent offense, who were already out on bail for something else. So these are people who were out on bail for something, and then were arrested and charged again for another violent attack that they committed
Wow.
while on bail, and then they got bail again 75% of the time. So that is what this piece of legislation has done. And
That is just horrific. I just cannot imagine the carnage this makes on people's lives and their families, their friends, the whole community. It just sends a trauma wave through, like the consequences of that are hard to wrap one's mind around.
yeah, everyone forgets that there's a cascading, when someone is violently attacked or
Yeah.
murdered, especially when they're murdered, there is, the consequences of that ripple throughout families, ripple throughout communities.
Yeah. No,
And
it's outrageous. So, Aaron, in that, and you were alluding to it earlier, the philosophy or the approach to this kind of judicial philosophy, um, like this approach, how the heck do they square the circle? Like, how is any of this compassionate? Like, if you're a caring, compassionate leader, decision maker, how do you think this is compassion with that kind of increase? Like in Windsor, Ontario, a 400% increase in violent crime. Like, this is, I don't mean to sound so dramatic, but this is insane. How does a caring person think this is the reasonable way to go?
because while they're driven by ideology and not facts, not logic, and you have judges and politicians who will see somebody convicted of, say, their 50th serious offense, their 50th violent assault, let's say, And their approach, which is not obviously in line with most Canadians, is to say, oh, well, why are they committing this assault? They must have had a rough upbringing, or society must have been, maybe they were bullied at school or something like that. And it's our job as a government to try to provide them supports and release them back into society, not taking into account at all the potential ramifications of that decision on many innocent Canadians who keep getting assaulted or even murdered by these individuals. And there's also, by the way, this applies to people convicted of repeat sexual assault or rape who are just being released back,
Wow.
either with no jail time or 18 months or whatever the case may be. And it's
You know,
leaving, the judges and the politicians making these decisions aren't bearing the consequences for making this. So it's like the safe injection sites, right? You'll never have a
yeah,
politician who they will go on about the purported benefits of these facilities, but they're never putting one in their backyard, right? They're never
exactly.
putting
Yeah.
one in their neighborhood. And
Well,
it's
certainly in the public policy world, we would refer often to the great Thomas Sowell, who said that insane systems are one that you design where the decision makers undertake their decisions, but the consequences never come back to them. So if you think of like our healthcare system as an example, or this case, the MPs, the judges, these officials don't live with these consequences of it. It's just the working people of Canada that are suffering, and innocent at that. They don't even have anything to do with this, but they're being impacted. So it's really atrocious. The other thing that I found fascinating in the documentary is that you put your finger on also the emerging creature of this type of way of thinking, and that is that we'll have a different treatment of offenders based on their race, their ethnicity, if you will. Um, and I thought, you're like you tell powerfully the story of the tragedy of the James Cree First Nation, where some 11 people were murdered by a prolific offender. So are you seeing the emergence then of two judicial systems in our country, two different standards of law then?
for sure. And it's might be one of the most perverse forms of affirmative action imaginable, because at least with other forms of affirmative action, which I would not be super supportive of for similar reasons, but at least with those, you can make the argument they're somehow righting some kind of historical wrong and leveling the playing field and bringing up certain groups that have been historically marginalized. These policies boomerang back and hurt the exact same groups they're purported to help the most. I mean, it's also very paternalistic. Let's say with Indigenous Canadians, I
Mhm,
mean, the vast majority of Indigenous Canadians are not running around committing violent crimes
mhm,
and being charged for violent crimes. And to suggest otherwise is in fact quite racist, to be honest.
mhm.
And so the idea that, and when Indigenous people, like any group, do commit crimes, they're likely to commit crimes within the area that they live and within the community's family, especially. So when you're repeat um, violent criminals or repeat sexual predators who say happen to be Indigenous, just because they're Indigenous, they're likely to then go out and reoffend in those exact same communities, victimizing more Indigenous people, creating more intergenerational trauma, and actually furthering and entrenching the problem that
Yeah.
you claim you're purporting to fix. And that is why I find, and I mean the example that you use, which is featured in the documentary in Saskatchewan, is just one example because it's the most grabbing.
Mhm,
But this is happening on a much smaller scale. Domestic abuse, sexual assault, like I
mhm.
mentioned, and other violent crimes, especially on reserves, all the time. And I chatted with lots of. I mean, it's again, it's not. There's I talked to Indigenous Canadians, featured mainly Indigenous Canadians, in three other documentaries I did about how they want economic opportunity.
Mhm.
They
Right.
want to lift more Indigenous Canadians out of poverty and
Mhm.
finally kind of cash the check that they were promised of the Canadian dream so many years ago. Where they're not
Exactly.
looking, no one's like, hey, we need violent criminals who happen to be Indigenous released onto our streets. That is not what Indigenous people are looking for, and to suggest otherwise is completely, I think, completely missing the bigger picture, and as I said, quite paternalistic.
Well said. Yeah, this is an attack on the rule of law. And if we don't have the rule of law, how do we have a pathway to not only safety and human health, but also prosperity? They're all interrelated, aren't they, Aaron?
They are, and the final point is, I mean, just like the famous photo of Lady Just or statue of Lady Justice is, with the
Hmm.
blindfold around.
Yes.
That justice is supposed to be blind. Justice is not supposed to take into account one's ethnicity or color of their skin. And as I talk to prosecutors about and everyone's aware of what's going on, except the general public, I think. But everyone in the system knows what's going on, and and again, people, there's mitigating issues about that you might have from a personal perspective, but that's already built into the justice system
Hmm.
in pre-sentencing hearings. You don't need to have some special, uh, um, you know, separate lane for people of certain racial
Hmm.
identities or backgrounds, and it's just and again, there's something that I put on the screen from the BC Prosecutor Service, which I think is so disturbing, where they openly say that prosecutors should consider not charging Indigenous Canadians, for example,
Wow.
because they want to reduce the ratio of Indigenous people in jail. So it's kind of like it's crazy when you think about it, because it's not taking into account public safety. It's
Hmm.
not taking into account whether these people did the crimes, who are the victims, or the victims
Hmm.
Indigenous.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's just, hey, we want to hit an arbitrary quota of the
Hmm.
kind of people who are in our jail. Like, I think here's the identity of the people that should be in jail. 100% of the people that are in jail should be the ones that are a threat to public safety. That should be the only, and that committed violent crimes and
Hmm.
other criminal offenses. I mean, who cares what color their skin is? As if somebody breaks into your home and hits you or your wife over the head with a pipe, it shouldn't matter what the color of their skin is.
I think that's a very good insight as well. So within this context, I think again what you're doing, and again this is a marvelous documentary, Aaron, that you and your team have put together, because it's really revealing how the world has changed profoundly, almost behind the scenes. Like our justice system is not what you think it is anymore, and at the same time, the ground has shifted when it comes to drug policy in this country. So I did want to talk more about that. I think most people realize that the number of Canadians that are overdosing is an epidemic. Is it as really bad as we say it is?
I mean, I can't believe it. I mean, it's 6,000 Canadians, mainly young Canadians, sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, that overdosed and died last year, preventable deaths.
Six
One
thousand.
year, 6,000 people. I mean, it's the population of a small town, and I mean, this is an increase of over 1,000% from about 15 years ago. It is a absolutely shocking number. It should shock the consciousness of any Canadian. Over 2,000 of those are in BC, which is even more shocking from
Mhm.
a per capita
But
perspective.
what an absolute train wreck and waste of human life.
There's no larger waste of human life happening in the Western world right now. I mean, it's just, if I remember, not that it's a great comparison, but these are young. These are young people. These are people that have their entire lives in front of them. These are people that leave behind family members, and that rippling of trauma, um, and sorrow that goes throughout the communities. And I remember in our when we were in Afghanistan, I mean, we lost, I think, 155 Canadians
Mhm.
over around a 10-year commitment,
Yes, that's right.
which was the largest loss of military life since the Korean War in this country. And every time a body came back, it was very sad and traumatic for the country, and rightly so. But to put that in perspective, of there's 6,000 people dying preventable deaths every single year in this country. This isn't cancer or something that's
Mhm.
kind of a fact of life that we're trying to solve as much as we can. This is completely preventable, and it's I think says a lot about where society and where our culture is at right now. But it's and you're always going to have some of this, but the way it's been turbocharged and exacerbated by our own government and our own government's policies is very disturbing.
Mhm.
And I mean, it should be a top issue for all Canadians, really.
So I do want to zero in then on that seminal point about drug policy. We've heard a lot in this country about the claims that somehow policymakers talk about a safe drug supply. What does that mean, and is it safe?
Well, the first thing I'd say is I think it's an oxymoron. I don't think there's when it comes to opioids, which is what they're talking about, there is no such thing as a safe supply or a safer supply, as some of them have now started calling it. What they are, well, some activists mean different things, but in general, what they're talking about is the provision of drugs in a uh, from a from a chemistry perspective that are pure. I guess from like a pharmaceutical grade drugs,
Right.
in
As opposed to
consistent,
being made in someone's basement or something like that.
yeah, in consistent and predictable quantities. Now, a couple fallacies out there is you hear a lot about, the toxic drug crisis, in the sense that we have a toxic drug supply. I mean,
Mhm.
it's so misleading. The drugs themselves uh, are toxic. That's what it's not there. There isn't like the drugs have been contaminated.
Right.
Fentanyl will kill most people in very small amounts. Um, if you or I took, pure fentanyl, we would die virtually any amount outside of a very controlled medical setting. So these drugs, it's not that the drugs have been poisoned, the drugs are the poison. So that's the
Right.
first
Yeah.
thing to kind of
Drugs
wrap.
are a problem.
Yeah, the drugs are the problem in the first place, and supplying more of them is just going to get you more drug use.
Mhm.
Now, their argument is that people will be less likely to overdose if they are using drugs that are of a consistent potency. Let's say is maybe the best term to
Okay.
use.
So if you're an addict, you might as well take quote safe drugs and not get something that's contaminated in that drug.
Yeah, so that's one thing that they're saying. So when I originally made the documentary, that's what I assume was more of the problem. That's not
Mm.
really the problem. The bigger thing is that they don't know the potency of the fentanyl. So I'll explain. When I started to make out the documentary, I thought most people were dying from fentanyl overdoses because other drugs like cocaine or heroin were being laced with fentanyl.
Mm.
That is not what's happening. The addicts are addicted to fentanyl and seeking out fentanyl. Now, some of these activists will say that when they're doing fentanyl made in someone's basement, you don't know the exact potency of any given batch. Where obviously, if it's made in like a laboratory by a farm, you're better. You understand maybe how many milligrams you're taking,
Mhm.
a little bit more. But what the Safe Supply program is specifically doing right now is they're handing out something called hydromorphone, which is almost a pill form of heroin or a heroin substitute. It is
The
an
so-called
opioid.
dillies.
So Dilly is a short for Dilaudid, which is a brand name of hydromorphone.
Mhm.
It's about 3 times more powerful than OxyContin, to put it in perspective, which is obviously what fueled the opioid crisis in the first place. And they're being literally handed out like candy on Halloween by the federal government across the country,
So
uh,
just to clarify, so you're saying the federal government is handing out these drugs to people?
en masse. En masse. Now you have to. Sometimes you get tested, sometimes you don't. But basically, you walk into one of these addiction clinics that's specifically sponsored, safe supply clinics sponsored by Health Canada,
Mhm.
which is a whole other story. And you say you're addicted to fentanyl and you would like a prescription to so-called safe supply. You get the prescription. The the geniuses that thought this up in Ottawa somehow thought that addicts addicted to fentanyl would then instead take these hydromorphone tablets, which are notionally safer. It's an opioid. You can overdose on it just as like you can with fentanyl as well. But what they don't understand is the people that are addicted to fentanyl are addicted to the high that they get from fentanyl. That's why literally they risk their. I mean, they're not stupid. They understand the
Mhm.
risk. They know better than anybody the risks of doing fentanyl. Yet they
Mhm.
continue to do it every single day, and they're doing it in spite of those risks. And one of the things, because it's so risky, is you get a comparatively incredible high, which is what they're seeking. So if you give them a drug that has an inferior high from their perspective, they're not going to use it. Instead, they turn around and sell it to get the money to buy the fentanyl that they actually want. Meanwhile, those drugs that they've sold or traded to their drug dealers onto the black market then need to go find a different home. And these drugs are now being sold en masse, university campuses, college campuses, and even on high schools.
Wow.
And that is it's almost like a entry level drug or gateway drug, even though that term, some people don't like that term anymore, for young people who maybe have just started drinking or smoking pot, and
Yeah.
then are said, hey, you should try this pill. This is pharmaceutical. It's from the government. It's safe. It's from safe
Mhm.
supply,
Mhm.
and they're dirt cheap. You can get high off one of
Wow.
these tablets and they're dirt cheap because the government is flooding the streets with them. So they used to be 20, $30 a pill.
Yeah.
Now they're $2, $3 a pill,
Wow.
and they're very dangerous. I mean, to give you an example too, if you say you had surgery, or you had a really bad like ankle sprain, or well, I got a very like third degree groin tear when I was playing hockey, you might get like 1 milligram tablets of hydromorphone that
Mhm.
maybe you take like twice a day. These individuals, the safe supply program the government's handing out, they're giving these individuals 8 milligram tablets 30 times a day. 38. So you're in severe pain, you might take two 1 milligram tablets a day. They're getting 38 milligram tablets. So I mean and any of them, they're either selling the drugs, or in the cases that these addicts end up actually taking the hydromorphone, basically none of them are taking it orally. They're all dissolving it and shooting it into their system, which is you can overdose on it, because that's not how it's meant to take, and B, because you're not meant to shoot up these drugs. Um, they're obviously made like they have a certain release mechanism, and there's other things in the tablet that you're obviously not supposed to be injecting into your bloodstream. There's been a massive increase in people with um, spinal infarctions and things like that. And we interviewed one of those who
Mhm.
are quadriplegic, paraplegic. You see
Mhm.
people increasingly in wheelchairs and things like that in the downtown east side and in these different parts of these tent encampments. And that's a lot of times because they've been injecting the safe supply drugs, the so-called safe supply drugs, that's then leading to they lose use of their legs or other limbs.
Wow. Aaron, this is like out of a bad movie. It's almost like the government has become the biggest drug pusher in Canada now because they're flooding the market with all these drugs. Is that an
Yeah, no,
overstatement?
it's the cartel, the triad, the mafia, and the federal government. I mean,
Wow.
it's shocking to see. One pharmacist we interviewed said that she's dispensing one pharmacist at one pharmacy dispensing 1,000 of these 8 milligram hydromorphone. Again, they're kind of like a heroin substitute tablets every single day,
Wow.
and these
And
are being
all in the
diverted.
name of safe drug supply.
Yeah, that's exactly what. And there's doctors know that the doctors prescribing these drugs, the small number of doctors prescribing these drugs, know they're being diverted, and they don't care because from their kind of ideological perspective, oh, the more of these drugs that get out there, the better, um,
Yeah.
because maybe they'll displace the illegal drug supply, but it's
No.
just adding to it. It's just fueling the fire. We also chatted with people where the hydromorphone, it's an opioid like fentanyl, is going into sometimes the precursor that's actually used to make the fentanyl. So they'll just trade the drugs, and they'll go get it, and they'll mix it up, and
You really
it
can't make it up. So just to zero in a little bit on that whole ideological rationale to this quote safe drug supply, and you mentioned the word destigmatization. What do you mean by that, and what is that all about?
well, so when the government decriminalized drugs here in British Columbia, their stated purpose was to destigmatize drug use. And their argument is that because of stigma around drug use, the people haven't been getting into treatment. And I've chatted with so many addicts in recovery, and they just all laugh at that the idea that somebody's not getting into treatment because there's stigma around the drug use. People that are in the downtown east side shooting up, walking around like zombies, do not care, are
No.
way caring about the stigma for their actions.
That's almost laughable, isn't it? They don't care about stigma.
It is. It's completely laughable. And it's also overlooked. I mean, there's so much hypocrisy here. I mean,
Hmm.
first of all, societies will always stigmatize certain behaviors, and they stigmatize behaviors that have negative societal consequences or personal consequences.
Hmm.
People look down on things that you shouldn't be doing. I
Yeah.
mean, we've
Well,
created.
it's funny, Aaron. It's almost like it begs the question: aren't there healthy things, or isn't it healthy to stigmatize bad things like drugs or not working?
Well, it's bizarre because the people pushing these policies, especially the left-wing governments, I mean, they're all for stigmatizing other things. They stigmatize smoking cigarettes, for example, and
Hmm.
quite
Yeah.
successfully. They stigmatize drinking and driving over the past 60 years, and quite successfully. And they stigmatize domestic abuse and spousal abuse, which used to be
Exactly.
quite commonplace, and quite successfully. We see much less of all three of those things. And yet, when it comes to hard drug use, and the use of things like heroin, crystal meth, fentanyl, and cocaine, which I would say probably have the most societal consequences, especially if they're being used en masse. They want to go in the exact opposite direction and run campaigns like use with a friend, or it's okay to use, or use safely, or they're handing out these safer snorting kits on high schools here in British Columbia.
Sorry,
So
what do you mean by that, Aaron? They're handing out snorting kits for drugs? What are you talking about?
So at a high school in British Columbia, a group that came in, that was obviously invited in by the school, handed out or left behind. I mean, it's the same thing essentially. Gave to students these kits called safer snorting kits, which you can look up, which is presumably supposed to make it easier or somehow more safe to snort drugs,
Wow.
like cocaine, like hydromorphone. We talked to students that had become addicted to this drug, and they said that most people were snorting it. That's how they were. That's how they were taking the safe supply pill that the
Wow.
government had manufactured.
So on that point, Aaron, you've alluded to this. It's like these policies, these governments are really facilitating the development of the next generation of drug users, really young people, and it's very, very heartbreaking. So we do have a clip from the documentary that we'd like to play now that talks about that a little bit.
This is a 16-year-old girl currently in recovery from hydromorphone addiction. When did you first hear about hydromorphone, or what kind of names are people using for it on campuses?
So obviously being young, you don't know too much about what everything's called, what the professional names for, let's say what it is. So it would be dilly or dilaudid and stuff like that. Nobody ever really calls it hydromorphone or anything like that.
And when did you first hear about it? Do you remember, or when did you first notice people using them? Or
I'd say when I started grade 10, beginning of grade 10, so beginning of last year, it almost destroyed my life.
Thanks to our own government introducing safe supply drugs like hydromorphone into street circulation, it has now never been cheaper or easier for children to get their hands on highly addictive and deadly opioids. Are people using it, you think, even younger than grade 10?
I see 14 and 13-year-olds using hydromorphone. Sometimes even 12-year-olds. It's I hate saying it out loud because it's you almost don't want to believe it. It doesn't seem real at all, but it's so real.
I am now seeing much younger people than I've ever seen in my life. I even had a 15-year-old patient who is in grade 9 tell me he started when he was in elementary school.
And what kind of opioids are these?
It would have been Dilaudid.
At the direction of our federal government, hydromorphone has flooded our streets and into the pockets of our children.
That is a very moving clip, Aaron, and those must have been very difficult interviews for you to undertake.
They were. I mean, it was when I set out to make this project, I wasn't expecting to end up in that room interviewing that 16-year-old girl. It was like every kind of discovery led to another one, and it's just as she says that there's a fire. Purdue Pharmaceuticals with the mass distribution of OxyContin created this inferno of addiction
Mhm.
that's been spreading throughout our country and has taken tens of thousands of lives in this country alone. And the government's attempting to put it out by pouring kerosene on it. I mean, that is literally our approach. I mean, the crisis that was started by the provision of a very powerful addictive opioid that was distributed en masse that flooded into our streets. We are now attempting, which we are now suing Purdue for, by the way, in British Columbia. We are now attempting to put out by providing flooding our streets with an even more powerful, just as addictive opioid called hydromorphone or Dilaudid, as you mentioned, which is also made by Purdue Pharmaceuticals, by the way. The story doesn't get more bizarre. So it's very disturbing. It's sad because so many of these kids. This one individual is on. First of all, she's on Suboxone, which is like a methadone. It's an opioid replacement therapy, which I think plays a role in helping to solve this. But I mean, to have to be 16 and on this drug is nobody should be in that situation. That is very sad to begin with. And the other thing is that there's going to be, I mean, she said all of her friends were doing them and are addicted, and some will be able to quit, some will be able to get onto Suboxone, and others will struggle and will go further down the addiction path. Some will start shooting up hydromorphone, and some will end up on the streets using fentanyl and inevitably overdosing and dying. And it all started with a single pill.
Wow. I do want to ask a little bit about the professionals around this issue. Um, I one of the quotes I always think of that I was taught as a young person was that by Martin Luther King Jr. was the problem with evil is not so much the evildoers, it's the silence of the good people. So where are these professions when we think of them, whether it's the teaching professions like the school boards, the pharmacists, um, physicians? I mean, there's so many of them, and I don't mean to be sound simplistic or finger pointing, but there's a lot of professions that are ethically bound to professional standards and action. So, do you have any sense of where they waking up to this issue?
I mean, a lot of people are scared for their. I mean, this is a culture that we live in right now, where everyone's scared to speak out on things because of the kind of cancel culture, political climate that we live in,
Hmm.
the kind of the social media climate, and this kind of ideological mob that are financially invested in concepts like harm reduction and safe supply, who will go after you relentlessly if you speak out on this. I mean, we Dr. Sharon Koivu, who was just in that clip that you showed,
Hmm. Yes.
she was going back and forth and finally decided to go on camera. Basically said like, well, I'm at the end of my career anyways, so
Wow.
I'll be okay. But
So
yeah,
she felt vulnerable as well, even as an established physician.
oh yeah, no, they're everyone's scared to say something. And I mean, they see the consequences. I mean, look, if you're living, you have to have your head in the sand to not see the consequences of these policies. And most doctors, um, are not comfortable prescribing these drugs. Don't prescribe these
Mhm.
drugs. But most people are not willing to speak out about it because they worry about professional consequences, professional ramifications for doing so. And it just makes it more important that I dig around and find the individuals who will speak out and who will stand up and say this isn't right.
Wow. So, in light of the kind of, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Aaron, but it seems like these professional groups are overwhelmingly silent. There are some that are heroes that are speaking up, and there's but we don't have anything like a healthy debate about these policies, do we?
No, we don't. We don't have a healthy debate. We don't have a healthy discussion. I think that's one reason how we got here is that there hasn't been up until quite recently. I think it's starting to happen now. There hasn't been that dialogue, but there hasn't been the other side saying, "Hold on a second." I
Hmm.
mean, we've been trying this in Vancouver for 25 years. The situation's not getting better. Why is that?
Exactly. Yeah.
What's going on in the rest of the world? Why is this not happening in Portugal or Denmark
Hmm.
or Germany, or why do we have this really bad problem specific to here in Canada? And what are some alternate solutions to approach it. So that's been the problem. But the politicians, have been completely, captured in the sense on the left by these activists and these advocacy groups who believe that there should be open season for drug use and society should just live with the consequences, and that's that. So
And even if all these people are dying, literally, even including young people in the prime of their life.
yeah, and it's amazing how they still think they still pretend like they have the compassionate high ground when it's their policies that have led to the deaths of tens of thousands of Canadians and hundreds of thousands of people across North America. There's more people that have died, that have overdosed, and over the past 10 years in this country that died in World War II and
Yeah,
or very close to it. I mean, it's a shocking number of people,
it really
and the
is.
situation's not getting better. And yet these ideologues just refuse to admit that their policies aren't working.
No, it's truly insane. So I did want to shift to the theme of hope, and one of the things I found very moving within the documentary is you talk about the theme of hope, both in terms of individual lives and even jurisdictions. And one of them is the province of Alberta, the so-called Alberta Model that's known internationally around the world. I was really impressed. I didn't have an idea of the how ambitious and the scale of effort going on to deal with this drug crisis. Can you tell us more about what the Alberta model is?
Yeah, so to the extent that we have a fork in the road, and there's a bunch of people that want to, in British Columbia, they think the solution is to hand out more drugs. In some cases, the exact same drugs that caused the problem in the first place. In Alberta, they're doing a different approach. It's called the recovery-oriented system of care, and that is a recovery and treatment based model that places hope at the center of what they're trying to accomplish and works to get these people the help that they need to get them clean off of drugs and to return them to being productive, tax-paying, and law-abiding citizens of society once again. And the goal there is to build these mini communities. They're building 10 of them. The first one that we toured is already finished. I don't know if it's open yet. It'll be opening very soon. And the idea is to build these recovery centers, and with the idea that this is an extension of healthcare and should be accessible to all Albertans. And it's already seen the steps that have already been taken have seen tremendous amount of success. And the idea is, I think, to place, on one hand, I would say from an overarching perspective, the goal is to make it easier to get into treatment than it is to get your next fix. In British Columbia, it is incredibly easy. You can go to anywhere basically and get your next fix in the open. Whereas there's huge wait lists to actually get into treatment programs. In Alberta, they want to make it the opposite, where anybody can enter treatment at any time just by calling a number. Whereas these drugs are not going to be flooding into the streets and being provided by the government. And if you continue to use drugs openly and cause issues, there are going to be an increasing kind of levels of social sanctions. They're not going to be arresting drug addicts and throwing them into jail, but they're also going to be sending a clear message that says what you're doing is not okay, and but government and society is here to help you if you decide to take another approach. So I think it is it's already, I think, proving successful. And a big part of it is also changing a culture, because culture is very important. And in British Columbia, you've got a situation where you basically told people that this is your lot in life and the government's going to provide you with as much drugs as you need for the rest of your life. And here's a hotel room and here's a lock to close your door and good luck with everything.
Wow.
And in Alberta, they're going to instead be taking away those drugs and saying, here's another option, and helping to guide people through that. Again, and this is not just a simple detox program. This is a cohesive and very robust treatment facility. And another thing is I always point out the hypocrisy on this, because if you're Justin Trudeau or you're Jagmeet Singh, the two politicians that are the most vocal proponents of this policy, and one of your kids or family members become addicted to these drugs, the solution for them is not going to be here's some hotel, some crime-ridden hotel, and here's a bag of free drugs. Good luck. That's not what they're going to get. They're going to get world-class treatment, abstinence-based treatment, and recovery, and the skills that they need to turn their lives around. And that's what they're going to get. But for some reason, these politicians think that for everybody else in society, working class Canadians, Indigenous Canadians, all they need are this so-called safe supply of drugs. So it's I think it's hypocrisy at the highest level, and a really disturbing amount of it.
Exactly. So the Alberta model makes a lot of sense. It sounds a little bit like the model in Portugal as well, where they have decriminalized drug use, but they strongly discourage it, and they do hold you to increasing levels of accountability not to use drugs. But they make drug dealing with your addiction easy. Is that the bottom line here?
Yeah, and they provide disincentives to using drugs and incentives to
Yeah,
getting into treatment and getting clean.
exactly.
So, I mean, there's no open drug use in Portugal. You're not allowed to use drugs openly like you can in British Columbia, for example. People try to make the comparison. It's not even a remotely accurate comparison. And they even have things called they're called drug dissuasion committees. So, if you're caught using drugs in Portugal, you are issued a summons. Basically, you have to appear before a panel and explain yourself. And if it's maybe a first offense or second offense and you don't seem to have a problem, they'll basically say, don't do it again. Whereas if you're clear that you have an issue that's causing other kind of ripples throughout your community or family, then the government slowly starts turning up the pressure on you to incentivize you to get into treatment.
Well said, Aaron. And this is really a time really to call our fellow citizens and ask them, what can we do to help change these insane policies, these policies that are hurting so many Canadians? Any advice on that?
I mean, I always tell people, we live in a democracy, fortunately. So we need to have, I think, political change in this country. And that starts by having these conversations. It should change either politically with new people in power, or by putting pressure on those in power to change the destructive course that they're currently on. And we need to turn up the temperature. We need to spread the word. We need people to become politically active and engaged. And that doesn't mean you have to, you know, share things on social media. Maybe it means you share things in your family group chat. Maybe it means you start to bring up a topic at dinner. Maybe it means that you do volunteer with a local political candidate or something in the next election. But people need to understand that we're all shareholders in this country. We're all and a democracy is only as strong as its citizenry. And right now in British Columbia, as long as I've grown up, there's been a lot of apathy, and I think that apathy has been destructive. I think that apathy has been partly because of our media and other things, and universities. But I think that people gotta take responsibility as a citizen and ask. Um, you can spend as long as you want talking about how bad the situation is, which is important. But then when you're done that, ask, okay, what can I do in my way to help make it a little bit better, and find a way to push back in your own little way.
I think that's right on, Aaron. And certainly as a former elected official myself, it does make a difference to call your elected official, both at the local level, provincial level, the federal level, and express your concern. This is a vital issue that affects the health and well-being of all of us. So I really commend you for doing this documentary. It's terrific that it has over 1 million views to date. I encourage our audience to share that documentary with others, share this conversation that we've had today with others, because it's through awareness that we can have that healthy debate that's long overdue in this country about these policy areas.
I couldn't agree more, and thank you so much for having me. And it's just it's good to finally see this debate and this discussion starting to happen on these important issues.
So thank you so much, Aaron Gunn, the producer of Canada is Dying, the documentary. And I encourage you to watch it. So thank you so much for joining us and for your courage and your leadership.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.